The slave finished the prayer. The king could never complete. The great hall of Ravenmoor Castle stood silent as death itself, its towering pillars casting shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. King Roderick Blackstone knelt before the altar, his crowned head bowed, his jeweled fingers clasped so tightly they had turned white. The assembled court held its collective breath, watching their sovereign struggle with words that would not come. "Most Holy Father, grant us—" The king's voice faltered, cracking like ice beneath spring's first thaw. His jaw worked soundlessly, searching for the continuation of the sacred prayer of sovereignty, the ancient invocation that every ruler of Ravenmoor had spoken flawlessly for 500 years. Without its completion, the kingdom would fall under divine curse, or so the prophecy claimed. Behind the rows of nobles, pressed against the cold stone wall with iron shackles binding his wrists, stood Matthias. Dirt caked his face. His tunic bore the stains of countless labors, yet his grey eyes remained fixed upon the king with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. He had been captured 3 years ago during the raids on the southern monasteries, when King Roderick had declared all religious scholars enemies of the crown for refusing to surrender their sacred texts. "Grant us," the king tried again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the hall's chill. "Grant us the wisdom to—" Archbishop Cornelius shifted nervously beside the altar, his ornate robes rustling like autumn leaves. He had coached the king for weeks, yet somehow the words that had seemed so clear in private practice now scattered like startled birds. The archbishop's eyes darted to the court astrologer, Master Theron, whose pale face had grown even more ashen. They all knew what the ancient text proclaimed. A king who could not complete the prayer of sovereignty would bring 7 years of plague upon the land. Queen Isabel rose from her throne, her emerald gown sweeping across the marble floor as she moved to her husband's side. "My lord," she whispered, though in the oppressive silence every word carried to the farthest corners of the hall, "perhaps we should postpone—" "Silence!" King Roderick's roar echoed through the chamber, causing several courtiers to flinch. "I am the rightful king. The prayer will bend to my will, as all things must." He turned back to the altar, his breathing ragged. "Most Holy Father, grant us the wisdom to rule with—" The words died in his throat once more. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, like wind through wheat. Lord Commander Garrett's hand moved unconsciously to his sword hilt, while Lady Margot covered her mouth with a silk handkerchief, her eyes wide with fear. It was then that Matthias spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the vast space. "To rule with mercy where power would destroy, to seek truth where comfort would deceive, to embrace humility where pride would blind." Every head in the hall turned toward the slave. King Roderick spun around so quickly his crown shifted askew, his face purple with rage. "You dare speak in this sacred place, slave?" Matthias continued as if he had not heard, his eyes now closed, his voice gaining strength. "Grant us the courage to kneel before the lowly, to raise up the fallen, to remember that all crowns are but circles of metal, and all thrones but carved stone. Let our reign be measured, not in gold accumulated, but in tears dried, not in enemies conquered, but in hearts united." "Seize him!" the king commanded. But the guards stood frozen, transfixed by the impossible sight before them. The prayer of sovereignty, the most closely guarded secret of the royal family, was flowing from the lips of a common slave like water from a spring. Archbishop Cornelius stepped forward, his face pale. "Your Majesty, how does he know the words? These prayers have been kept in the royal vault for—" "Continue with your blasphemy, slave," the king snarled, drawing his ceremonial dagger. "Complete it if you can, and I will complete you." Matthias opened his eyes, and for a moment they seemed to hold depths that had no ending. "Grant us the wisdom to see that the smallest seed may grow the mightiest oak, that the quietest voice may speak the greatest truth, that the most scarred hands may offer the gentlest touch. In our governance, let us remember the forgotten. In our justice, let us remember mercy. In our power, let us remember its source flows not from us, but through us. The slave's words seemed to make the very air in the hall grow thick with significance. Several nobles had fallen to their knees, not in deference to their king, but in recognition of something far older, far more profound than political authority. Duke Aldwin, the king's own cousin, stepped forward from his place among the highest nobility. "Roderick, stop this madness. If he knows the prayer, he knows nothing." King Roderick advanced on Matthias, dagger raised. "He is a temple thief, a deceiver who memorized stolen words. Then why can you not speak them?" The question came from young Prince Garrett, the king's own son, barely 16 winters old. The hall gasped collectively at the prince's audacity. King Roderick whirled to face his heir, his face contorting with fury and something else, fear. "You too would question your king?" "I question why a slave speaks with heaven's authority while a king stammers in silence," Prince Garrett replied, his voice steady despite his youth. Matthias continued the prayer, each word falling like drops of rain on parched earth. "Let us not forget that kingship is service crowned, that sovereignty is sacrifice adorned, that the mightiest fortress is built on foundation stones of justice and compassion. When we feast, let us remember the hungry. When we rest in comfort, let us remember the weary. When we sit in judgment, let us remember we too shall be judged." Master Theron, the court astrologer, suddenly cried out and pointed to the great window behind the altar. The assembled court turned to look and gasped in unison. The sky, which had been the color of old iron all morning, was now splitting apart, revealing streams of golden light that fell directly upon Matthias, making his chains gleam like silver rather than iron. "It is a sign," whispered Lady Margot. "The heavens themselves bear witness." "Tricks!" King Roderick roared. "Sorcery and deception!" But his voice cracked with desperation. He had spent months preparing for this ceremony, the renewal of the divine compact that occurred only once in a generation. Without it, his legitimacy would crumble like sand. Queen Isabel approached her husband slowly, as one might approach a wounded wolf. "My lord, perhaps we should listen. If this slave knows the prayer, there must be a reason. The old laws speak of tests, of worthiness, proven not through blood, but through spirit," completed Archbishop Cornelius, his eyes widening with sudden understanding. "Your Majesty, the ancient texts, there is a passage I had thought mere metaphor. It speaks of the prayer choosing its vessel, not the vessel choosing the prayer." Matthias's voice rose, filling the hall with resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "Grant us the understanding that power unused for good is power corrupted, that wealth unshared is poverty of spirit, that knowledge hoarded is ignorance multiplied. Let our laws be written not to bind, but to liberate, not to punish, but to restore, not to divide, but to unite." The king stumbled backward, his dagger clattering to the floor. Where Matthias stood, the very air seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly presence. Several courtiers later swore they saw the faint outline of wings, though others claimed it was merely the play of light through the stained glass. "Who are you?" King Roderick's question came out as barely a whisper. Matthias met his gaze directly for the first time. "I am Brother Matthias of the Order of the Eternal Word, last keeper of the monastery of St. Erasmus, which your soldiers burned to the ground 3 winters past. I am the guardian of the true prayer, the complete prayer, not the fragments your ancestors preserved in gold and locked away in darkness." Lord Commander Garrett stepped forward, his military mind processing the implications. The monasteries, they weren't hoarding wealth, they were preserving the original texts. The prayers were never meant to be secrets," Matthias continued, his voice now carrying the weight of profound sorrow. "They were meant to be spoken by all, remembered by all, lived by all. But kings and queens found power in scarcity, in making sacred what was meant to be shared. Generation after generation, you carved away pieces of the prayer, removing the passages that spoke of equality, of service, of the divine spark in every soul, not just those born to purple. Prince Garrett moved closer to the slave, drawn by something he couldn't name. Then the prayer my father speaks, the one he struggles with, is but a shadow of a shadow, Matthias confirmed. 9/10 lost to pride and fear. Your father cannot complete it because the words themselves reject the hollow vessel of a heart that knows only dominion, never service. King Roderick's rage reignited. Guards, I command you to silence this blasphemer. But the guards remained motionless. Captain Marcus, veteran of a dozen campaigns, slowly removed his helmet. I cannot, Your Majesty. I remember my grandmother speaking words like these when I was a child. She said they were from the old times, before the prayers were taken from the people. A ripple of recognition passed through the hall. Others began to nod, remembering fragments heard in childhood, whispered by elderly relatives who spoke of a time when the divine was not locked behind palace walls. Matthias continued, his voice now tender with compassion. Grant us the grace to fail with dignity, to rise with hope, to lead with love. Let our legacy be not in statues of stone, but in the hearts we've touched, not in the wars we've won, but in the peace we've fostered, not in the fear we've inspired, but in the hope we've kindled. Duke Aldwyn suddenly fell to his knees. I remember, he gasped, my mother on her deathbed. She spoke these very words. She said they were the true noble oath from before the sundering of the sacred. The sundering of the sacred? Prince Garrett looked to Archbishop Cornelius for explanation. The Archbishop's hands trembled as he clutched his ceremonial staff. A legend, or so I thought. 5 centuries ago, when King Roderick I established the Blackstone dynasty, it is said he seized all holy texts and rewrote them, keeping the complete versions only for the royal line. Those who protested were branded as heretics and driven into exile, Matthias finished. My order descended from those exiles. We preserved the true prayers in memory and manuscript, passing them from teacher to student, parent to child, awaiting the day when they would be needed again. Queen Isabel stepped away from her husband, her face pale but resolute. The plagues, the famines, the wars that have haunted our kingdom for generations are the harvest of seeds sown in that first betrayal, Matthias confirmed. The land itself grieves the breaking of the covenant between ruler and ruled, between heaven and earth. King Roderick drew himself up to his full height, trying to reclaim his authority through sheer physical presence. I am king by right of blood and conquest. These are the laws of the world. These are the laws of men who feared to kneel, Matthias responded gently. But the divine recognizes no bloodlines save the one that flows in all veins, acknowledges no conquest save that of love over hatred, admits no sovereignty save that earned through service. Diet. The light streaming through the windows grew brighter, and suddenly the hall was filled with a sound like distant singing, as if 1,000 voices were joining in harmony just beyond the edge of hearing. Several courtiers began to weep openly, touched by something they couldn't fully understand. Matthias raised his shackled hands, and the chains fell away as if they were made of mist. The guards stepped back in awe, but he made no move to flee. Instead, he walked slowly toward the altar, each step deliberate and meaningful. The prayer nears its end, he said, his voice now barely above a whisper, yet heard by all. But know this, it cannot be completed by one voice alone. It was written to be spoken in chorus, ruler and ruled together, each voice equal in the divine ear. Prince Garrett was the first to move, stepping forward to stand beside Matthias. Then teach us, brother Matthias, teach us the words our ancestors stole from us. You cannot. King Roderick's voice broke completely. I forbid it. I am your king. You are my father, Prince Garrett replied sadly, and I love you for that. But you are no longer my king. A king who cannot speak heaven's language has no claim to heaven's mandate. One by one, others began to move forward. First Duke Aldwyn, then Captain Marcus, then Lady Margot. Soon, half the court stood with the slave and the prince, while the other half remained frozen in place, torn between loyalty and revelation. Archbishop Cornelius looked at the gathering crowd, then at his king, then finally at the ancient tome he carried, its pages yellow with age. Slowly, reverently, he opened it to a page near the back, a section sealed with wax that bore the mark of the first Roderick. With trembling fingers he broke the seal. "By all that is holy," he breathed. "It's here, the complete prayer. It's been here all along, hidden in our own archives." He looked up at King Roderick with tears streaming down his face. "We had the truth and buried it beneath our lies." Matthias nodded slowly. "The truth has a way of preserving itself, even in the darkest places. Your ancestors could not bring themselves to destroy it completely. Some part of them knew that one day it would be needed." "Read it," Queen Isabel commanded, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "Archbishop, read what was hidden." Archbishop Cornelius began to read, his voice shaking. "Let it be known that the prayer of sovereignty is not the prayer of the sovereign alone, but the covenant between all souls within the realm. It shall be spoken not by one voice but by all, not in dominion but in unity, not as commandment but as promise." The hall fell silent as the weight of centuries of deception settled upon them like a heavy cloak. King Roderick sank to his knees, not in prayer, but in defeat, his crown rolling away across the marble floor with a hollow metallic sound. Matthias extended his hand to the fallen king. "It is not too late, Roderick Blackstone. The prayer can still be completed, the covenant can still be renewed, but not with you standing above and others kneeling below. We must all stand together, or all fall apart." "I don't know the words," the king whispered, and for the first time in his reign there was no anger in his voice, only a profound emptiness. "I never knew the words. My father taught me fragments, as his father taught him. We built our power on incomplete foundations." "Then learn them now," Matthias said simply. "The divine cares nothing for when we come to truth, only that we come." Prince Garrett knelt beside his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Father, please, for the kingdom, for us, for yourself." King Roderick looked up at his son, then at the slave who had revealed himself as a holy man, then at his court, divided between old loyalty and new understanding. His shoulders sagged as years of rigid pride finally crumbled. "Teach me," he said, the two words costing him more than all the battles he had ever fought. Matthias smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost luminous. "Then let us begin again, all of us together. Form a circle, noble and common, rich and poor, powerful and powerless. In this prayer, there are no distinctions." Slowly, hesitantly, the court began to move. Servants crept forward from the shadows where they had been standing. Guards removed their helmets and joined the circle. Even the kitchen staff, drawn by the commotion, entered the hall and were welcomed into the growing ring of humanity. Lord Commander Garrett helped King Roderick to his feet and guided him into the circle. The king stood between his son and the slave he had threatened to kill, the three of them linked by hands that trembled with the magnitude of the moment. "Now," Matthias said, "we speak as one voice, one heart, one kingdom under heaven. Repeat after me. But more than that, feel the words, mean them, live them." And so they began, hundreds of voices joining in unison. "Most Holy Father, grant us the wisdom to rule with mercy where power would destroy." As the prayer continued, something extraordinary began to happen. The walls of the great hall, built from stones quarried in conquest and mortared with the tears of the oppressed, began to gleam with a soft, warm light. The shadows that had always lurked in the corners retreated, and the air itself seemed to grow clearer, cleaner. To seek truth where comfort would deceive, to embrace humility where pride would blind. King Roderick's voice, at first barely audible, grew stronger with each phrase. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke words that his ancestors had hidden, words that challenged everything he had been taught about power and privilege. "Grant us the courage to kneel before the lowly, to raise up the fallen, to remember that all crowns are but circles of metal, and all thrones but carved stone." In the city beyond the castle walls, people stopped in their daily labors as they heard the sound carrying on the wind. The prayer, spoken by so many voices in unity, seemed to ripple outward like waves on a pond, touching every ear and every heart. Let our rain be measured not in gold accumulated, but in tears dried, not in enemies conquered, but in hearts united. An old woman selling bread in the market began to weep as she recognized words her great-grandmother had whispered to her in secret. A blacksmith paused at his anvil, remembering songs that had been forbidden in his youth. Children playing in the streets stopped and listened, not understanding the words but feeling their power. Grant us the wisdom to see that the smallest seed may grow the mightiest oak, that the quietest voice may speak the greatest truth, that the most scarred hands may offer the gentlest touch. Inside the great hall, the transformation was becoming visible. The iron chains that decorated the walls as symbols of the kingdom's might over its enemies began to rust and crumble. The weapons displayed as trophies of war tarnished and fell from their mountings. But in their place, something new was growing, vines of golden light that sprouted from the very stones, flowering into blossoms of pure radiance. Queen Isabel gasped as she felt something shift within her own heart, years of cold calculation melting away. She looked at her husband and saw not the tyrant he had become, but the young prince she had once loved, before power had poisoned them both. In our governance, let us remember the forgotten. In our justice, let us remember mercy. In our power, let us remember its source flows not from us, but through us. Master Theron pointed to the windows where the light was streaming in with ever greater intensity. "Look," he cried, "the sky itself bears witness." Indeed, the clouds that had covered Ravenmoor for months, the grey shroud that had seemed to mirror the kingdom's spiritual malaise, was breaking apart. Shafts of sunlight, pure and warm, broke through to touch the earth for the first time in living memory. Let us not forget that kingship is service crowned, that sovereignty is sacrifice adorned, that the mightiest fortress is built on foundation stones of justice and compassion. As they spoke these words, King Roderick felt something breaking inside him, like a dam finally giving way to the pressure of waters too long contained. He sobbed openly, his tears falling onto the marble floor, where they seemed to wash away years of bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing had ever been able to remove. "I have been a fool," he said between the verses, though no one condemned him for breaking the rhythm of the prayer. "A blind, prideful fool." "We all have been," Duke Aldwyn replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "We chose comfort over truth, safety over righteousness, power over justice." And Matthias nodded, but kept the prayer moving forward. "When we feast, let us remember the hungry. When we rest in comfort, let us remember the weary. When we sit in judgment, let us remember we too shall be judged." The circle of speakers had grown so large now that it filled the entire hall. Nobles stood hand in hand with servants, merchants with beggars who had somehow found their way inside. The artificial barriers that had divided them for so long seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. Grant us the understanding that power unused for good is power corrupted, that wealth unshared is poverty of spirit, that knowledge hoarded is ignorance multiplied. Prince Garrett felt something awakening within him, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with inheritance or bloodline. He looked at Matthias and saw not a slave, but a teacher, not a prisoner, but a liberator. He understood now that true nobility had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with choice. Let our laws be written not to bind, but to liberate, not to punish, but to restore, not to divide, but to unite. The prayer was nearing its conclusion, and everyone could feel it. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, as if the very kingdom was holding its breath. The light from the windows had grown so bright that it was almost blinding, yet no one looked away. Archbishop Cornelius, reading from the ancient text while also speaking with the crowd, came to a passage that made him pause. "There is more," he said in wonder. A final verse that was not just hidden, but actually cut from the pages. But I can see its imprint on the following page, like a ghost of words once written. "I know it," Matthias said quietly. "It is the verse that terrified the first Roderick most of all, for it speaks of the ultimate truth of power." "Speak it!" King Roderick commanded, but then caught himself. "Please, brother Matthias, share it with us." Matthias nodded and raised his voice for the final verse. "And when at last our reign is ended, when our crown is laid aside and our throne stands empty, let us be remembered not as those who ruled, but as those who served, not as those who commanded, but as those who loved, not as those who stood above, but as those who lifted others. For in the final measure, a kingdom's greatness is not in its king's glory, but in its people's joy, not in its palace's splendor, but in its humblest home's contentment, not in its army's might, but in its children's laughter." As the last word faded, a profound silence fell over the hall. Then, starting as a low rumble and building to a roar, came a sound from outside, cheering. The entire city of Ravenmoor was cheering, as if they had all heard the prayer, all felt its power, all been changed by its truth. King Roderick removed his crown with shaking hands and set it on the floor. "I am not worthy of this," he said simply. "None of us are worthy," Matthias replied. "That is the point. Leadership is not about worthiness, but about willingness. Willingness to serve, to sacrifice, to place others before oneself." "Then what happens now?" Queen Isabel asked. "If the old ways are broken, what takes their place?" "That is for all of us to decide," Matthias said. "Together, not as ruler and ruled, but as people sharing a common destiny. The prayer is complete, but its living out has just begun." Prince Garrett picked up his father's crown and studied it thoughtfully. "Perhaps it should not sit on one head but be melted down, its gold used to feed the hungry and house the homeless. Or perhaps," suggested Lady Margot, emboldened by the moment, "it should remain, but as a reminder of what was, and a warning of what must never be again." King Roderick looked at the assembled crowd, seeing them truly for perhaps the first time in his life. "I have much to atone for," he said. "Years of cruelty and blindness cannot be undone with a single prayer." "No," Matthias agreed, "but they can begin to be undone with a single step, and then another, and another. Redemption is not a destination, but a journey." Captain Marcus stepped forward. "The dungeons are full of prisoners whose only crime was speaking truth to power. Shall we free them?" "Yes," King Roderick said immediately. "Free them all, and more than that, compensate them for their unjust suffering." "The monasteries that were burned," Duke Aldwyn added, "they must be rebuilt, and the texts that were hidden must be shared," Archbishop Cornelius declared, holding up the ancient tome. "No more secrets, no more hidden knowledge. Let all who wish to learn have access to wisdom." As they spoke of reforms and reparations, of justice and renewal, Matthias quietly stepped back from the center of attention. His work here was nearly done. The prayer had been spoken, the truth revealed, the healing begun. But Prince Garrett noticed his movement and caught his arm. "Where are you going, brother Matthias? We need you. I need you. There is so much to learn, so much to undo and rebuild." Matthias smiled kindly at the young prince. "The teacher's role is to awaken, not to lead. You have everything you need within you and around you. The prayer lives in all hearts. It always has. It just needed to be remembered. But surely you'll stay to help guide us. For a time, perhaps. But know this, young prince, the moment you depend on one voice for truth, you risk recreating the very system you've just escaped. Listen to all voices, especially the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that have been silenced for too long." King Roderick approached them, his steps uncertain, like a man learning to walk again. "Brother Matthias, I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid. I threatened your life and you saved my soul." "You owe me nothing," Matthias replied, "but you owe them everything." He gestured to the crowd of people still standing in the circle, their hands linked, tears and joy mingling on their faces. A young serving girl, no more than 12, tugged on Matthias's sleeve. "Brother, will you teach us the other prayers too? The ones that were taken from us?" "I will teach you better than that," Matthias said, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "I will teach you to find the prayers that already live in your heart, the ones no king can steal and no law can silence." As the sun set over Ravenmoor that day, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that had not been seen for generations, the great hall remained full of people. They talked and planned, argued and agreed, laughed and cried. Nobles sat on the floor with peasants, sharing bread and wine. Children ran between the adults, their laughter echoing off walls that had known only stern silence for so long. King Roderick, still king in name but no longer in the old manner, worked alongside his former subjects to draft new laws. The first law, written in Prince Garrett's hand, was simple. "The prayer of sovereignty shall be spoken each day at sunrise and sunset, in every square and every home, by all who choose to speak it, as a reminder that power shared is power multiplied, and service given is sovereignty earned." Queen Isabel, who had spent years maintaining cold distance from her people, now sat with a group of washerwomen, learning their names, their stories, their struggles. She discovered that one of them, old Martha, had been her own wet nurse decades ago, cast out of the castle when Isabel had come of age because it was deemed inappropriate for royalty to maintain bonds with servants. "I never forgot you, my lady," Martha said, her weathered hands holding the Queen's smooth ones. "I prayed for you every day, that someday your heart would soften. It seems your prayers were stronger than all my walls," the Queen replied, embracing the old woman as tears flowed freely down both their faces. Archbishop Cornelius had spread the ancient tome on a table and was carefully transcribing its hidden pages, making copies to be distributed throughout the kingdom. "There are other prayers here," he announced to any who would listen. "Prayers for healing, for harmony, for hope. All meant to be shared, all stolen from their rightful owners, the people themselves." As he worked, scholars and scribes who had hidden their literacy for fear of being seen as threats to the crown came forward to help. Soon, a dozen hands were copying the sacred words, and plans were being made to teach reading and writing to all who wished to learn. Master Theron, the court astrologer, had abandoned his complex charts and calculations. "The stars told of this day," he admitted to Duke Aldwyn, "but I was too afraid to speak it clearly. I couched it in riddles and ambiguities, protecting myself rather than serving truth." "We all did," Duke Aldwyn replied. "We made compromises with our consciences, told ourselves we were being prudent when we were really being cowardly." As the night grew late, Matthias stood to address the assembly one more time. The hall fell silent, all eyes upon him. "Tomorrow the real work begins," he said. "Today we spoke words. Tomorrow we must live them. It will not be easy. There will be those who resist change, who preferred the old ways, who benefited from inequality and injustice. There will be moments when you will want to return to the simplicity of one voice commanding and others obeying." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But remember this moment. Remember how it felt to stand as equals, to speak as one, to discover that the divine dwells not in palaces, but in people. Remember that the slave could speak the prayer the king could not because the slave was special, but because the slave had never forgotten that he was human, while the king had forgotten everything but power." King Roderick stood as well, and for a moment the two men faced each other, the king who had everything and the slave who had nothing, yet who had revealed where true wealth resided. "I relinquish my absolute rule," the king declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "From this day forward, Ravenmoor shall be governed not by one, but by many, not by blood, but by wisdom, not by force, but by consensus. Let councils be formed from every guild, every district, every walk of life. Let the voice of the smallest child carry the same weight as the voice of the highest noble." A murmur ran through the crowd, excitement, fear, uncertainty, hope, all mingled together. "But what if we fail?" someone called out. "What if we cannot agree? cannot govern ourselves. It was Matthias who answered, "Then you will fail as free people, not as slaves. You will make mistakes as equals, not suffer the mistakes of tyrants. And in failing and rising again, you will learn what it truly means to be sovereign, not over others, but over yourselves." Prince Garrett stepped forward. "I renounce my claim to inheritance by blood. If I am to serve Ravenmoor, let it be because the people choose me, not because my father was king. And I," said Queen Isabel, removing her own crown, "renounce my title. I am Isabella, no more and no less, equal to all, superior to none." One by one, the nobles began removing their signs of rank: coronets, chains of office, hereditary swords. They placed them in a pile at the center of the hall, a monument to the old ways that were passing. But it was a young voice that asked the question everyone was thinking. The serving girl who had spoken to Matthias earlier called out, "Does this mean we're all kings and queens now?" Matthias laughed, a warm, rich sound that filled the hall with genuine mirth. "No, child. It means something far better. It means you are all human, all divine, all precious beyond measure. It means you need bow to no one and no one need bow to you. It means you are free." As if his words were a signal, the great doors of the hall swung open, and the people of the city began to pour in. Word had spread through Ravenmoor like wildfire. The old ways were ending. A new age was beginning. They came with questions, with hopes, with fears, with dreams too long deferred. The hall could not hold them all, so the gathering moved into the courtyard, then into the streets. Torches were lit, tables were brought out, food was shared. The castle's stores, hoarded for potential sieges, were opened to feed the multitude. Wine that had been reserved for royal lips was passed from hand to hand among people who had never tasted anything but water and weak ale. But more than food and drink was shared that night. Stories were told. Stories of suffering under the old system, but also stories of secret kindness, of quiet resistance, of hope maintained against all odds. Songs that had been forbidden were sung again, their melodies rising to the stars. Dances that had been condemned as too joyful for common folk were danced until dawn. Matthias moved through the crowd, no longer the center of attention, but simply one among many. He helped serve food, he listened to stories, he held crying children and comforted grieving adults. This was what he had always understood that the powerful had forgotten, that true strength came not from standing above, but from standing with. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, he found himself standing beside Prince Garrett on the castle walls, looking out over the city. "It looks different," the prince said softly. "The same buildings, the same streets, but different." "You're seeing it with new eyes," Matthias replied. "Eyes that see people, not subjects, lives, not resources, hearts, not hands to labor." "Will it last?" the prince asked. "This change, this hope, will it survive the light of day?" "That depends," Matthias said, "on whether the prayer remains words or becomes deed. Every choice from this moment forward will either strengthen or weaken what was born tonight. Every act of justice will build it up. Every return to old habits will tear it down." "You're leaving, aren't you?" Prince Garrett's voice held no surprise, only sadness. "Soon. There are other kingdoms, other prayers that have been hidden, other truths that need speaking." "But what if we need you?" Matthias placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You don't need me, you never did. All I did was speak words that already lived in your hearts. The prayer was always yours, it was just waiting for someone to remember it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise over a kingdom reborn. Then Prince Garrett asked, "The prayer we spoke, is it complete now? Truly complete?" Matthias smiled. "A prayer is never complete. It grows with each speaking, deepens with each understanding, spreads with each sharing. What you spoke last night was the beginning, not the end. Then teach me the rest. Teach us all." "I already have," Matthias said. "Every time you choose mercy over judgment, service over dominion, love over fear, You add a new verse to the prayer. Every time you lift someone up instead of keeping them down, you speak words more sacred than any scripture. Down in the courtyard, people were beginning to stir. The work of transformation would begin soon, laws to rewrite, systems to rebuild, wounds to heal. It would take years, perhaps generations, to fully undo the damage of centuries. King Roderick appeared on the walls, looking haggard but somehow younger, as if shedding the weight of tyranny had restored years to his life. "Brother Matthias," he said, "before you leave us, there is something I must know. When I had you in chains, when I threatened your life, were you not afraid?" "I was terrified," Matthias admitted. "But fear and faith are not opposites. They can exist in the same heart at the same moment. I was afraid of death, but more afraid of silence. Afraid of pain, but more afraid of allowing the prayer to remain incomplete. You could have escaped. When the chains fell from your wrists, that was no miracle, was it? You had found a way to unlock them." Matthias smiled. "Perhaps, or perhaps the universe has ways of opening doors when truth needs to walk through them. Does it matter?" "I suppose not," the king said. "But tell me this. Why did you wait 3 years? Why endure slavery and suffering when you could have revealed the truth at any time?" "Because truth spoken too soon is often truth rejected. You needed to fail at the prayer publicly, completely. The people needed to see that the emperor had no clothes, that the divine mandate you claimed was hollow. And I needed to be certain that I spoke from humility, not from vengeance." Queen Isabel joined them, carrying a basket of bread. She offered pieces to all 3 men, and they ate together as equals, watching the sun rise. "The other kingdoms will not understand," she said. "They will see our transformation as weakness, as an opportunity to invade. Let them come," Duke Aldwin said, approaching with Captain Marcus. "They will find that a people fighting for their freedom are stronger than any army fighting for a king's glory." Or, suggested Archbishop Cornelius, who had worked through the night copying texts, "we could send emissaries to share the complete prayer with other kingdoms. What has happened here could happen everywhere." "A revolution of spirit rather than sword," Prince Garrett mused. "It could work." "It will work," Matthias said with quiet certainty, "because the hunger for truth, for justice, for genuine connection with the divine, these are universal. Every kingdom has its slaves who remember what kings have forgotten. Every palace has its shadows where sacred words are whispered. The awakening has begun, and it cannot be stopped." As they spoke, a commotion arose in the courtyard below. A group of riders had arrived, nobles from the eastern provinces who had heard garbled reports of chaos in the capital. Lord Blackwood, the king's own brother, dismounted and strode into the courtyard, his hand on his sword. "Roderick!" he bellowed. "What madness is this?" The messenger spoke of slaves leading prayers, of crowns cast aside, of the natural order overturned. King Roderick looked down at his brother, then at his companions on the wall. "Will you come with me?" he asked them. "To explain, to show him what we've discovered." "We will all go," Matthias said. "This is the first test. How we handle it will determine much." And they descended together, king and slave, prince and servant, noble and common, and met Lord Blackwood in the courtyard. The lord's eyes widened as he saw his brother without crown or regalia, standing among commoners, as if he belonged there. "Brother," King Roderick said calmly, "there is much to explain. But first, would you join us in morning prayer? Prayer, have you lost your mind? The kingdom must be in chaos. Where are your guards, your crown, your authority?" "My authority," King Roderick replied, "was an illusion. My crown was a weight that prevented me from lifting my head to heaven. My guards are now my equals, free to protect or not, as their conscience dictates." Lord Blackwood's face purpled with rage. "This is treason, madness! I'll restore order myself if you won't." He drew his sword, but before anyone could react, the serving girl who had spoken to Matthias stepped forward. She was small, barely reaching Lord Blackwood's chest, but she showed no fear. "Would you strike down a child, my lord?" she asked simply. "Is that the order you would restore?" Lord Blackwood hesitated, his sword wavering. "Get out of my way, girl." "No," she said. "I have as much right to stand here as you. That is what we learned last night. That is what the prayer teaches." "What prayer? What nonsense has poisoned your minds?" And so they told him, not all at once, not in confrontation, but gently, patiently. People who had been there the night before began to share what they had experienced. They spoke of the words that had moved them, the truths that had been revealed, the chains, both literal and figurative, that had been broken. Lord Blackwood listened, his sword slowly lowering as person after person testified to the transformation they had witnessed and felt. When Matthias finally spoke the prayer again, this time in its entirety, even the hardened lord felt something stir within him. "These words," Lord Blackwood said slowly, "I've heard fragments before. My grandmother, she used to mumble them when she thought no one was listening." "Because they belong to all of us," Prince Garrett explained. "They always have." By midday, Lord Blackwood had joined them, not fully convinced, perhaps, but willing to listen, to learn, to consider that maybe the world could be different than he had always believed it must be. And so it went, day after day, as word spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. Some came to challenge, others to mock, still others to learn. But all who heard the complete prayer felt something shift within them, some long-buried knowledge awakening. Matthias stayed for a full turning of the moon, helping to establish the new councils, teaching those who wished to learn the full corpus of prayers that had been hidden, working alongside others to begin the long process of healing and rebuilding. On his last night in Ravenmoor, a great feast was held, not in the castle but in the main square where tables were set for thousands. Rich and poor ate together, sharing food and stories. Children performed plays depicting the night of transformation. Musicians played songs that wove the sacred prayers into melodies that would carry them to every corner of the kingdom. King Roderick, who now insisted on being called simply Roderick, stood to address the gathering. "We mark tonight not an ending, but a beginning. Brother Matthias came to us as a slave and leaves us as a teacher. He spoke the prayer we could not complete, and in doing so, completed us." "But remember," Matthias interjected, standing as well, "I was only the voice. You were all the prayer. Every one of you who stood in that circle, who opened your heart to truth, who chose courage over comfort, you were the prayer being spoken into existence." Young Prince Garrett, who had spent the month working in the fields and workshops to understand the lives of common folk, raised his cup. "To the slave who finished the prayer the king could never complete. May we never forget that wisdom comes not from crowns, but from conscience." The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, but Matthias raised his own hand for silence. "If you must toast, toast to yourselves. Toast to your courage in accepting change. Toast to your wisdom in recognizing truth. Toast to your strength in choosing the harder path of freedom over the easier path of servitude." As the feast continued into the night, Matthias quietly gathered his few belongings. He needed no fanfare for his departure. The work here would continue without him. But as he reached the city gates, he found a crowd waiting. They had come not to prevent his leaving, but to bid him farewell. Each person carried a candle, and in the darkness, the light of thousands of small flames created a river of luminescence that stretched from the gates back into the heart of the city. "We wanted you to know," Archbishop Cornelius said, "that the light you kindled will not die with your departure." "It was never my light," Matthias replied. "It was always yours. I merely reminded you where to find the flint and tinder." One by one, people approached him. Some offered blessings, others thanks, still others simple touches of hands that said what words could not. The serving girl who had stood up to Lord Blackwood pushed through the crowd and hugged him around the waist. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Perhaps," Matthias said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "But more likely, you will go forward. Take the prayer to places I could never reach. Speak it in ways I could never imagine. Make it live in deeds I could never perform." As he stood to leave, King Roderick, simply Roderick now, approached for a final word. "I hated you," he said quietly. "When you first spoke the prayer, I wanted nothing more than to see you dead, I know, but you saved me. Not from death, but from something worse, from living a lie so completely I had forgotten it was a lie. You saved yourself the moment you asked to learn. That took more courage than any battle you ever fought. They embraced then the former king and the former slave, equals at last in their shared humanity. As Matthias walked into the night, the candles remained lit behind him, a constellation of hope in the darkness. He could hear, carried on the wind, the sound of voices beginning the evening prayer. Most Holy Father, grant us the wisdom to rule with mercy where power would destroy. The prayer would continue now without him, spreading from voice to voice, heart to heart, kingdom to kingdom. The slaves would finish what kings could never complete, because they understood what rulers so often forgot, that the divine speaks most clearly through the humble, shines most brightly through the broken, and loves most deeply through those who have learned that love is the only power that matters. Miles away, in another kingdom where another king struggled with empty words and hollow ceremonies, a slave looked up from his labor and felt, without knowing why, that change was coming. Somewhere, somehow, the prayers that had been stolen were being returned. The words that had been silenced were being spoken. And in Ravenmoor, as the season turned and the first free harvest was brought in, the people gathered each dawn and dusk to speak together the prayer that no single voice could own, no single power could control. Children learned it before they learned to read. Adults found in it daily strength for the hard work of building a just society. Even those who had benefited most from the old ways discovered that shared prosperity brought a joy that hoarded wealth never could. The transformation was not perfect or immediate. There were setbacks, conflicts, moments when the old ways seemed easier. Some nobles fled to other kingdoms, warning of chaos and rebellion. Some commoners, drunk on newfound freedom, went too far in their demands for change. But through it all, the prayer continued. Each morning and evening, voices rose together. Grant us the wisdom to rule with mercy where power would destroy. And with each speaking, the words grew stronger, deeper, more real. Prince Garrett, who spent his days learning governance through service rather than command, often thought of Matthias and wondered where he was. Reports came occasionally. A kingdom to the south where slaves had suddenly remembered ancient songs. A city to the west where a mysterious teacher had appeared in the marketplace, speaking of prayers that belonged to all. "He's spreading it," Garrett said to his father one evening as they worked side by side in the council chambers, reviewing petitions from citizens, "like seeds on the wind." "And we are the soil," Roderick replied, "trying to prove that such seeds can grow, can flourish, can bear fruit." "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked. "The loss of absolute power." Roderick was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that it took a slave in chains to teach me what freedom meant. I regret the years of suffering my blindness caused, but regret the transformation itself? Never. I was a king who could not complete a prayer. Now I am a man who can." Queen Isabel, simply Isabella now, entered with a group of women who had formed a council to address the needs of the kingdom's children. "The orphanages are overflowing," she reported. "So many children lost their parents to the old regime's wars and prisons. Then we open our homes," suggested one of the women, a baker's wife named Sarah. "Those of us who can, we take them in, not as servants, but as family." "The castle has many empty rooms," Isabella added, looking at her husband and son. "Rooms that once housed treasures could house children." And so it was decided, and within days the sound of children's laughter echoed through halls that had known only solemn silence for generations. The former royal family found themselves teaching letters to street orphans, sharing meals with children who had never known parents, discovering that love multiplied when divided. It was one of these children, a boy named Timothy, who had been born in the dungeons to a political prisoner, who asked the question that would echo through history: "If the prayer made us all equal, does that mean God loves the slave and the king the same?" "No," said Garrett, causing everyone to look up in surprise. Then he smiled. God loves the slave more, for the slave never forgot how to love back. The years passed, and Ravenmoor became known throughout the land, not for its military might or its wealth, but for something far more precious, its joy. Travelers spoke of a kingdom where people sang as they worked, where children were taught to question rather than obey, where leaders served rather than ruled. Other kingdoms watched with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some sent spies to learn the secret of Ravenmoor's transformation, but the spies often stayed, seduced by the freedom they found. Others sent armies to restore proper order, but soldiers who came to conquer found themselves invited to join in the evening prayer, and many laid down their arms rather than attack people who greeted them with bread rather than battle. The prayer, meanwhile, spread like water, finding every crack, every crevice where truth could take root. Slaves in distant lands began to whisper words they claimed to have heard on the wind. Nobles found themselves troubled by dreams in which they stood equal with their servants. Children played games where everyone was king and no one was subject. And somewhere, walking roads whose dust had known the feet of prophets and kings, slaves and scholars, Matthias continued his journey. He aged, his hair growing white as fresh snow, his steps slower but no less determined. In each place he stopped, he listened more than he spoke, learned more than he taught, received more than he gave. For he knew a secret that even Ravenmoor had yet to fully understand. The prayer was not something he had brought to them, but something he had helped them remember. It had always been there, written not in books, but in hearts, preserved not in temples, but in the stubborn human refusal to accept that some were born to rule and others to serve. One day, many years after leaving Ravenmoor, Matthias received word that King Roderick had died, but the message did not speak of a state funeral or royal succession. Instead, it told of a man who had spent his last years teaching former slaves to read, who had given away every treasure he owned, who had died holding the hands of people who had once feared his name. The message ended with words that brought tears to the old teacher's eyes. He completed the prayer at last, not with his voice, but with his life. Prince Garrett, now chosen as first speaker of the Council of Equals, wrote separately, "We have built the world you showed us was possible. Come home, teacher, and see what your seeds have grown." But Matthias knew his home was the road, his family every soul who yearned for freedom, his kingdom every heart that dared to believe that the last could be first, and the first could be last. There were still prayers to be completed, still chains to be broken, still truths to be spoken. Yet he did return once, years later, when his body had grown too frail for constant travel. He arrived at Ravenmoor's gates not announced, not recognized, just another old traveler seeking rest. The city had grown, spreading beyond its walls in neighborhoods where former slaves lived as craftsmen, where former nobles worked as teachers, where children of all backgrounds played together in streets that were safe because everyone watched over everyone. He attended the evening prayer in the square, standing at the back of the crowd, his voice just one among thousands. The words had evolved, grown, taken on new verses that spoke to challenges he had never imagined. But the heart remained the same, the radical notion that power was meant to be shared, that service was the highest calling, that love was the only law that mattered. After the prayer, a young woman approached him. Something in her bearing was familiar, and when she smiled, he knew it was the serving girl who had stood up to Lord Blackwood, now grown, now a leader in her own right. "Brother Matthias," she said softly, "we've been waiting for you. You recognized me. I would recognize the voice that gave us back our voices anywhere," she said. "Come, there is someone who wants to meet you." She led him through the city to a modest house where an old man sat in a garden, teaching a group of children. The man looked up, and Matthias saw it was Roderick, aged beyond his years, but with eyes that held peace he had never known as king. "Teacher," Roderick said, rising with difficulty to embrace him, "you came back." "I came to see what became of the prayer," Matthias replied. "Look around you," Roderick said, gesturing to the children, the garden, the city beyond. "It became life. It became hope. It became everything you promised and more. They sat together in the garden as the sun set, two old men who had once been master and slave, now simply friends watching children play. The children were reciting the prayer, but playfully, turning it into a song, a game, a living thing that danced between them. They don't even know it's a prayer anymore, Roderick mused. To them, it's just how people speak to each other, how they live with each other. Then it has truly succeeded, Matthias said. When the sacred becomes so normal, we forget it was ever thought impossible. That is when heaven and earth meet. That night, Matthias died peacefully in his sleep. They found him with a smile on his face and a piece of parchment in his hand. On it was written a single line: "The prayer is complete when it needs no words at all." They buried him in the garden where he had spent his last evening, and on his simple stone they carved, "Here lies a slave who taught kings to kneel and kingdoms to rise." But even in death his work continued, for every person who had heard the prayer carried it forward. Every child who grew up free because of it became a living verse. Every act of justice, every choice of mercy, every moment when someone with power chose to serve rather than be served, added to the endless prayer that had begun when one slave spoke the words, "One king could not." The story spread, as all true stories do, changing with each telling but keeping its essential truth. Some said Matthias had been an angel in disguise. Others claimed he was just a man who had remembered what others had forgotten. Some insisted the prayer had magical power. Others said its only power was in revealing the magic that had always existed in human hearts. But in Ravenmoor, they knew the truth. The prayer was not finished when Matthias spoke the last word. It was not finished when the kingdom transformed. It was not finished when the old ways died and the new were born. The prayer continued with every dawn, every choice, every moment when someone chose love over fear, service over dominance, truth over comfort. And so it continues still, in every place where the last speak truths the first cannot bear to hear, where the weak reveal the strength the powerful never knew they lacked, where slaves finish prayers kings can never complete. For the prayer was never about words at all. It was about the radical recognition that the divine does not dwell in palaces but in people, does not speak through crowns but through conscience, does not rule through might but through mercy. And in that recognition, kingdoms fall and are reborn, not through revolution's blade, but through revelation's light. The slave finishes the prayer the king could never complete, and in that completion, both are freed. The slave from chains, the king from the heavier bondage of believing he was born to bind others. This is the prayer that cannot be silenced, the truth that cannot be chained, the hope that cannot be killed. It lives in every heart that dares to believe that another world is possible, every voice that speaks when silence would be safer, every hand that reaches out when holding back would be easier. The prayer is never complete because it is always beginning, always growing, always finding new voices to speak it and new hearts to live it. It started before Matthias and continued after him. It speaks in every language, honors every tradition, includes every soul who chooses inclusion over exclusion, love over law, grace over greed. In the end, the slave finished the prayer the king could never complete, not because the slave was special, but because the slave remembered what the king had forgotten, that we are all both slave and king, all both servant and sovereign, all both broken and whole. The prayer completes us by revealing our completion in each other, our freedom in our mutual liberation, our sovereignty in our shared service. And so the prayer continues, will always continue, must always continue, until every chain is broken, every knee bends not in submission but in service. Every crown is laid aside in recognition that the only throne worth occupying is the seat of compassion in another human heart. The slave finishes the prayer the king could never complete, and in that finishing, a new world begins, always, endlessly, forever beginning, never complete, because completion would mean the end of growth, the death of hope, the silence of the eternal song that rises whenever humans remember they are more than their stations, more than their status, more than the roles they have been told they must play. The prayer lives. The prayer continues. The prayer waits in every heart for the moment when a slave will stand and speak what power cannot say, when the last will reveal what the first has forgotten, when the lowest will lift all higher by refusing to remain below. This is the prayer that finishes kings and begins kingdoms of the heart. This is the prayer that completes itself by never being complete. This is the prayer that saves by revealing we were never lost, only sleeping. And now, awakened, we speak it together. Slave and king, servant and sovereign, all one voice, one heart, one prayer that builds the world that was always meant to be.